Chapter 60 of The Titan by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Net. The storm which burst in connection with Cowperwood's machinations at Springfield early in 1897 and continued without abating until the following fall attracted such general attention that it was largely reported in the Eastern papers. F.A. Cowperwood versus the state of Illinois. Thus, one New York daily phrased the situation. The magnetizing power of fame is great. Who can resist utterly the luster that surrounds the individualities of some men, causing them to glow with a separate and special effulgence? Even in the case of Berenice, this was not without its value. In a Chicago paper which she found lying one day on a desk which Cowperwood had occupied was an extended editorial which interested her greatly. After reciting his various misdeeds, particularly in connection with the present state legislature, it went on to say, "He has an innate, chronic, unconquerable contempt for the rank and file. Men are but slaves and thralls to draw for him the chariot of his greatness. Never in all his history has he seen fit to go to the people directly for anything. In Philadelphia, when he wanted public franchise control, he sought privily and by chicane to arrange his affairs with a venal city treasurer. In Chicago, he has uniformly sought to buy and convert to his own use the splendid privileges of the city, which should really redound to the benefit of all. Frank Algernon Cowperwood does not believe in the people. He does not trust them. To him they constitute no more than a field upon which corn is to be sown, and from which it is to be reaped. They present but a mass of bent backs, their knees and faces in the mire, over which, as over a floor, he strides to superiority. His private and inmost faith is in himself alone. Upon the majority he shuts the gates of his glory in order that the sight of their misery and their needs may not disturb nor alloy his selfish bliss. Frank Algernon Cowperwood does not believe in the people." This editorial battle cry, flung aloft during the latter days of the contest at Springfield, and taken up by the Chicago papers generally and by those elsewhere, interested Berenice greatly. As she thought of him, waging his terrific contests, hurrying to and fro between New York and Chicago, building his splendid mansion, collecting his pictures, quarreling with Aileen, he came by degrees to take on the outlines of a superman, a half-god or demi-gorgon. How could the ordinary rules of life or the accustomed paths of men be expected to control him? They could not and did not. And here he was pursuing her, seeking her out with his eyes, grateful for a smile, waiting as much as he dared on her every wish and whim. Say what one will, the wish buried deep in every woman's heart is that her lover should be a hero. Some out of the veriest stick or stone fashion the idol before which they kneel. Others demand the hard reality of greatness. But in either case the illusion of paragon worship is maintained. Berenice, by no means ready to look upon Cowperwood as an accepted lover, was nevertheless gratified that his erring devotion was the tribute of one able apparently to command thought from the whole world. Moreover, because the New York papers had taken fire from his great struggle in the Midwest and were charging him with bribery, perjury, and intent to thwart the will of the people, Cowperwood now came forward with an attempt to explain his exact position to Berenice and to justify himself in her eyes. During visits to the Carter house or in entr'actes at the opera or the theater, he recounted to her bit by bit his entire history. He described the characters of Hand, Schryhart, Arneel, and the motives of jealousy and revenge which had led to their attack upon him in Chicago. No human being could get anything through the Chicago City Council without paying for it, he declared. It's simply a question of who's putting up the money. He told how Truman Leslie McDonald had once tried to shake him down for $50,000, and how the newspapers had since found it possible to make money to increase their circulation by attacking him. He frankly admitted the fact of his social ostracism, attributing it partially to Aileen's deficiencies and partially to his own attitude of Promethean defiance, which had never yet brooked defeat. "And I will defeat them now," he said solemnly to Berenice one day over a luncheon table at the Plaza when the room was nearly empty. His gray eyes were a study in colossal, enigmatic spirit. "The governor hasn't signed my 50-year franchise bill." This was before the closing events at Springfield. "But he will sign it. Then I have one more fight ahead of me. I'm going to combine all the traffic lines out there under one general system. I am the logical person to provide it. Later on, if public ownership ever arrives, the city can buy it." "And then?" asked Berenice sweetly, flattered by his confidences. "Oh, I don't know. I suppose I'll live abroad. You don't seem to be very much interested in me. I'll finish my picture collection." "But supposing you should lose?" "I don't contemplate losing," he remarked coolly. "Whatever happens, I'll have enough to live on. I'm a little tired of contest." He smiled, but Berenice saw that the thought of defeat was a gray one. With victory was his heart, and only there. Owing to the national publicity being given to Cowperwood's affairs at this time, the effect upon Berenice of these conversations with him was considerable. At the same time, another and somewhat sinister influence was working in his favor. By slow degrees, she and her mother were coming to learn that the ultra-conservatives of society were no longer willing to accept them. Berenice had become at last too individual a figure to be overlooked. At an important luncheon given by the Harris Haggertys some 5 months after the Beals Chadsey affair, she had been pointed out to Mrs. Haggerty by a visiting guest from Cincinnati as someone with whom rumor was concerning itself. Mrs. Haggerty wrote to friends in Louisville for information and received it. Shortly after, at the coming-out party of a certain Geraldine Borgia, Berenice, who had been her sister's schoolmate, was curiously omitted. She took sharp note of that. Subsequently, the Haggertys failed to include her, as they had always done before, in their generous summer invitations. This was true also of the Landman Zieglers and the Lucas Demings. No direct affront was offered. She was simply no longer invited. Also, one morning she read in the Tribune that Mrs. Corscaden Batjer had sailed for Italy. No word of this had been sent to Berenice. Yet Mrs. Batjer was supposedly one of her best friends. A hint to some is of more avail than an open statement to others. Berenice knew quite well in which direction the tide was setting. True, there were a number of the ultra-smart of the smart world who protested. Mrs. Patrick Gilbenin, for instance. "No, you don't tell me. What a shame. Well, I like Bevy, and shall always like her. She's clever, and she can come here just as long as she chooses. It isn't her fault. She's a lady at heart, and always will be. Life is so cruel." Mrs. Augustus Tabriz. "Is that really true? I can't believe it. Just the same, she's too charming to be dropped. I, for one, propose to ignore these rumors just as long as I dare. She can come here if she can't go anywhere else." Mrs. Pennington Drury. "That of Bevy Fleming? Who says so? I don't believe it. I like her anyhow. The idea of the Haggertys cutting her. Dull fools. Well, she can be my guest, the dear thing, as long as she pleases." As though her mother's career really affected her. Nevertheless, in the world of the dull rich, those who hold their own by might of possession, conformity, owl-eyed sobriety, and ignorance, Bevy Fleming had become persona non grata. How did she take all this? With the air of superior consciousness which knows that no shift of outer material ill fortune can detract one jot from an inward mental superiority. The true individual knows themselves from the beginning and rarely, if ever, doubt. Life may play fast and loose about them, running like a racing destructive tide in and out, but they themselves are like a rock, still, serene, unmoved. Bevy Fleming felt herself to be so immensely superior to anything of which she was a part that she could afford to hold her head high even now. Just the same, in order to remedy the situation, she now looked about her with an eye single to a possible satisfactory marriage. Braxmar had gone for good. He was somewhere in the East, in China, she heard. His infatuation for her apparently dead. Kilmer Duelma was gone also, snapped up, an acquisition on the part of one of those families who did not now receive her. However, in the drawing rooms where she still appeared, and what were they but marriage markets? One or two affairs did spring up, tentative approachments on the part of scions of wealth. They were destined to prove abortive. One of these youths, Pedro Reiser Marcado, a Brazilian, educated at Oxford, promised much for sincerity and feeling until he learned that Berenice was poor in her own right, and what else? Someone had whispered something in his ear. Again, there was a certain William Drake Bowdoin, the son of a famous old family who lived on the north side of Washington Square. After a ball, a morning musicale, and one other affair at which they met, Bowdoin took Berenice to see his mother and sister, who were charmed. "Oh, you serene divinity," he said to her ecstatically one day, "won't you marry me?" Bevy looked at him and wondered. "Let us wait just a little longer, my dear," she counseled. "I want you to be sure that you really love me." Shortly thereafter, meeting an old classmate at a club, Bowdoin was greeted as follows. "Look here, Bowdoin, you're a friend of mine. I see you with that Miss Fleming. Now, I don't know how far things have gone, and I don't want to intrude, but are you sure you are aware of all the aspects of the case?" "What do you mean?" demanded Bowdoin. "I want you to speak out." "Oh, pardon, old man. No offense, really. You know me. I couldn't. College and all that. Just this, though, before you go any further. Inquire about. You may hear things. If they're true, you ought to know. If not, the talking ought to stop. If I'm wrong, call on me for amends. I hear talk, I tell you. Best intentions in the world, old man, I do assure you." More inquiries. The tongues of jealousy and envy. Mr. Bowdoin was sure to inherit $3,000,000. Then a very necessary trip to somewhere, and Berenice stared at herself in the glass. What was it? What were people saying, if anything? This was strange. Well, she was young and beautiful. There were others. Still, she might have come to love Bowdoin. He was so airy, artistic, in an unconscious way. Really, she had thought better of him. The effect of all this was not wholly depressing. Enigmatic, disdainful, with a touch of melancholy and a world of gaiety and courage, Berenice heard at times behind joy the hollow echo of unreality. Here was a ticklish business, this living. For want of light and air the finest flowers might die. Her mother's error was not so inexplicable now. By it had she not, after all, preserved herself and her family to a certain phase of social superiority? Beauty was of such substance as dreams are made of, and as fleeting. Not one's self alone, one's inmost worth, the splendor of one's dreams, but other things, name, wealth, the presence or absence of rumor and of accident, were important. Berenice's lips curled. But life could be lived. One could lie to the world. Youth is optimistic, and Berenice, in spite of her splendid mind, was so young. She saw life as a game, a good chance that could be played in many ways. Cowperwood's theory of things began to appeal to her. One must create one's own career, carve it out, or remain horribly dull or bored, dragged along at the chariot wheels of others. If society was so finicky, if men were so dull, well, there was one thing she could do. She must have life, life, and money would help some to that end. Besides, Cowperwood by degrees was becoming attractive to her. He really was. He was so much better than most of the others, so very powerful. She was preternaturally gay, as one who says, "Victory shall be mine anyhow." End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of The Titan by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cataclysm. And now at last Chicago is really facing the thing which it has most feared. A giant monopoly is reaching out to enfold it with an octopus-like grip, and Cowperwood is its eyes, its tentacles, its force. Embedded in the giant strength and goodwill of Heckelheimer, Gottlieb and Company, he is like a monument based on a rock of great strength, a 50-year franchise to be delivered to him by a majority of 48 out of a total of 68 aldermen, in case the ordinance has to be passed over the mayor's veto, is all that now stands between him and the realization of his dreams. What a triumph for his iron policy of courage in the face of all obstacles! What a tribute to his ability not to flinch in the face of storm and stress! Other men might have abandoned the game long before, but not he. What a splendid windfall of chance that the money element should of its own accord take fright at the Chicago idea of the municipalization of public privilege and should hand him this giant South Side system as a reward for his stern opposition to folderol theories. Through the influence of these powerful advocates, he was invited to speak by various local commercial bodies, the Board of Real Estate Dealers, the Property Owners Association, and the Merchants League, the Bankers Union, and so forth, where he had an opportunity to present his case and justify his cause. But the effect of his suave speechifyings in these quarters was largely neutralized by newspaper denunciation. Can any good come out of Nazareth? Was the regular inquiry. That section of the press, formerly beholden to Hand and Schryhart, stood out as bitterly as ever, and most of the other newspapers, being under no obligation to Eastern capital, felt it the part of wisdom to support the rank and file. The most searching and elaborate mathematical examinations were conducted with a view to showing the fabulous profits of the streetcar trust in future years. The fine hand of Eastern banking houses was detected and their sinister motives noised abroad. Millions for everybody in the trust, but not 1 cent for Chicago, was the Inquirer's way of putting it. Certain altruists of the community were by now so aroused that in the destruction of Cowperwood they saw their duty to God, to humanity, and to democracy straight and clear. The heavens had once more opened, and they saw a great light. On the other hand, the politicians, those in office outside the mayor, constituted a petty band of guerrillas or freebooters who, like hungry swine shut in a pen, were ready to fall upon any and all propositions brought to their attention with but one end in view, that they might eat, and eat heartily. In times of great opportunity and contest for privilege, life always sinks to its lowest depths of materialism and rises at the same time to its highest reaches of the ideal. When the waves of the sea are most towering, its hallows are most awesome. Finally, the summer passed. The council assembled. and with the first breath of autumn chill the very air of the city was touched by a premonition of contest. Cowperwood, disappointed by the outcome of his various ingratiatory efforts, decided to fall back on his old, reliable method of bribery. He fixed on his price, $20,000 for each favorable vote to begin with. Later, if necessary, he would raise it to $25,000 or even $30,000, making the total cost in the neighborhood of $1.5 million. Yet it was a small price indeed when the ultimate return was considered. He planned to have his ordinance introduced by an alderman named Ballenberg, a trusted lieutenant, and hand it thereafter to the clerk, who would read it, whereupon another henchman would rise to move that it be referred to the Joint Committee on Streets and Alleys, consisting of 34 members drawn from all the standing committees. By this committee it would be considered for 1 week in the General Council chamber, where public hearings would be held. By keeping up a bold front, Cowperwood thought the necessary iron could be put into his followers to enable them to go through with the scorching ordeal which was sure to follow. Already aldermen were being besieged at their homes and in the precincts of the ward clubs and meeting places. Their mail was being packed with importuning or threatening letters. Their very children were being derided, their neighbors urged to chastise them. Ministers wrote them in appealing or denunciatory vein. They were spied upon and abused daily in the public prints. The mayor, shrewd son of battle that he was, realizing that he had a whip of terror in his hand, excited by the long contest waged and by the smell of battle, was not backward in urging the most drastic remedies. "Wait till this thing comes up," he said to his friends in a great central music hall conference in which thousands participated, and when the matter of ways and means to defeat the venal alderman was being discussed. "We have Mr. Cowperwood in a corner, I think. He cannot do anything for 2 weeks, once his ordinance is in, and by that time we shall be able to organize a vigilance committee, ward meetings, marching clubs, and the like. We ought to organize a great central mass meeting for the Sunday night before the Monday when the bill comes up for final hearing. We want overflow meetings in every ward at the same time. I tell you, gentlemen, that while I believe there are enough honest voters in the city council to prevent the Cowperwood crowd from passing this bill over my veto, yet I don't think the matter ought to be allowed to go that far. You can never tell what these rascals will do once they see an actual cash bid of $20,000 or $30,000 before them. Most of them, even if they were lucky, would never make a half of that in a lifetime. They don't expect to be returned to the Chicago City Council. Once is enough. There are too many others behind them waiting to get their noses in the trough. Go into your respective wards and districts and organize meetings. Call your particular alderman before you. Don't let him evade you or quibble or stand on his rights as a private citizen or a public officer. Threaten, don't cajole. Softer, kind words won't go with that type of man. Threaten, and when you have managed to extract a promise, be on hand with ropes to see that he keeps his word. I don't like to advise arbitrary methods, but what else is to be done? The enemy is armed and ready for action right now. They're just waiting for a peaceful moment. Don't let them find it. Be ready. Fight. I'm your mayor and ready to do all I can, but I stand alone with a mere pitiful veto right. You help me, and I'll help you. You fight for me, and I'll fight for you. Witness hereafter the discomfiting situation of Mr. Simon Pinski at 9 p.m. on the second evening following the introduction of the ordinance in the ward house of the 14th Ward Democratic Club. Rotund, flaccid, red-faced, his costume a long black frock coat and silk hat, Mr. Pinski was being heckled by his neighbors and business associates. He had been called here by threats to answer for his prospective high crimes and misdemeanors. By now it was pretty well understood that nearly all the present aldermen were criminal and venal, and in consequence party enmities were practically wiped out. There was no longer for the time being Democrats and Republicans, but only pro or anti Cowperwoods, principally anti. Mr. Pinski, unfortunately, had been singled out by the Transcript, the Inquirer, and the Chronicle as one of those open to advanced questioning by his constituents. Of mixed Jewish and American extraction, he had been born and raised in the 14th and spoke with a decidedly American accent. He was neither small nor large, sandy-haired, shifty-eyed, cunning, and on most occasions amiable. Just now he was decidedly nervous, wrathy, and perplexed, for he had been brought here against his will. His slightly oleaginous eye, not unlike that of a small pig, had been fixed definitely and finally on the munificent sum of $30,000, no less, and this local agitation threatened to deprive him of his almost unalienable right to the same. His ordeal took place in a large, low-ceilinged room illuminated by 5 very plain, thin, 2-armed gas jets suspended from the ceiling and adorned by posters of prize fights, raffles, games, and the Simon Pinski Pleasure Association, plastered here and there freely against dirty, long, unwhitewashed walls. He stood on the low raised platform at the back of the room, surrounded by a score or more of his ward henchmen, all more or less reliable, all black-frocked, or at least in their Sunday clothes, all scowling, nervous, defensive, red-faced, and fearing trouble. Mr. Pinski had come armed. This talk of the mayor's concerning guns, ropes, drums, marching clubs, and the like had been given very wide publicity, and the public seems rather eager for a Chicago holiday in which the slaughter of an alderman or so might furnish the leading and most acceptable feature. "Hey, Pinski!" yelled someone out of a small sea of new and decidedly unfriendly faces. This was no meeting of Pinski followers, but a conglomerate outpouring of all those elements of a distrait populace bent on enforcing for once the principles of aldermanic decency. There are even women here, local church members, and 1 or 2 advanced civic reformers, and WCTU barroom smashers. Mr. Pinski has been summoned to their presence by the threat that if he didn't come, the noble company would seek him out later at his own house. "Hey, Pinski, you old boodler, how much do you expect to get out of this traction business?" This from a voice somewhere in the rear. Mr. Pinski, turning to one side as if pinched in the neck. "The man that says I am a boodler is a liar. I never took a dishonest dollar in my life, and everybody in the 14th Ward knows it." The 500 people assembled. "Ha, ha, ha! Pinski never took a dollar! Ho, ho, ho! Whoopee!" Mr. Pinski, very red-faced, rising. "It is so. Why should I talk to a lot of loafers that come here because the papers tell them to call me names? I have been an alderman for 6 years now. Everybody knows me." A voice. "You call us loafers, you crook?" Another voice, referring to his statement of being known. "You bet they do." Another voice, this from a small, bony plumber in work clothes. "Hey, you old grafter, which way do you expect to vote? For or against this franchise? Which way?" Still another voice, an insurance clerk. "Yes, which way?" Mr. Pinski, rising once more, for in his nervousness he is constantly rising or starting to rise and then sitting down again. "I have a right to my own mind, ain't I? I got a right to think. What for am I an alderman, then? The Constitution—" An anti-Pinski Republican, a young law clerk. "To hell with the Constitution. No fine words now, Pinski. Which way do you expect to vote? For or against? Yes or no?" A voice, that of a bricklayer, anti-Pinski. "He daresn't say. He's got some of that bastard's money in his jeans now, I'll bet." A voice from behind, one of Pinski's henchmen, a heavy, pugilistic Irishman. "Don't let them frighten you, Sim. Stand your ground. They can't hurt you. We're here." Pinski getting up once more. "This is an outrage, I say. Ain't I going to be allowed to say what I think? There are two sides to every question. Now, I think whatever the newspapers say that Cowperwood—" A journeyman carpenter, a reader of the Inquirer. "You're bribed, you thief. You're beating about the bush. You want to sell out." The bony plumber. "Yes, you crook. You want to get away with $30,000. That's what you want, you boodler." Mr. Pinski defiantly, egged on by voices from behind. "I want to be fair, that's what. I want to keep my own mind. The Constitution gives everybody the right of free speech, even me. I insist that the streetcar companies have some rights. At the same time, the people have rights too." A voice. "What are those rights?" Another voice. "He doesn't know. He wouldn't know the people's rights from a sawmill." Another voice. "Or a load of hay." Pinski continuing, very defiantly now, since he had not yet been slain. "I say the people have their rights. The companies ought to be made to pay a fair tax. But this 20-year franchise idea is too little, I think. The Mears bill now gives them 50 years, and I think all told—" The 500 in chorus. "Ho, you robber, you thief, you boodler! Hang him! Ho, ho, ho! Get a rope!" Pinski retreating with a defensive circle as various citizens approach him, their eyes blazing, their teeth showing, their fists clenched. "My friends, wait. Ain't I going to be allowed to finish?" A voice. "We'll finish you, you stiff." A citizen advancing, a bearded Pole. "How will you vote, hey? Tell us that. How, hey?" A second citizen, a Jew. "You're a no good robber. I know you for 10 years now already. You cheated me when you were in the grocery business." A third citizen, a Swede, in a sing-song voice. "Answer me this, Mr. Pinski. If a majority of the citizens of the 14th Ward don't want you to vote for it, will you still vote for it?" Pinski hesitating. The 500. "Oh, look at the scoundrel. He's afraid to say. He don't know whether he'll do what the people of his ward want him to do. Kill him. Brain him." A voice from behind. "Aw, stand up, Pinski. Don't be afraid." Pinski terrorized as the 500 make a rush for the stage. "If the people don't want me to do it, of course I won't do it. Why should I? Ain't I their representative?" A voice. "Yes, when you think you're going to get the wadding kicked out of you." Another voice. "You wouldn't be honest with your mother, you bastard. You couldn't be." Pinski. "If one half the voters should ask me not to do it, I wouldn't do it." A voice. "Well, we'll get the voters to ask you, all right. We'll get 9/10 of them to sign before tomorrow night." An Irish American, aged 26, gas collector, coming close to Pinski. "If you don't vote right, we'll hang you, and I'll be there to help pull the rope myself." One of Pinski's lieutenants. "Say, who is that freshy? We want to lay for him. One good kick in the right place will just about finish him." The gas collector. "Not from you, you carrot-faced terrier. Come outside and see." Business of friends interfering. The meeting becomes disorderly. Pinski is escorted out by friends, completely surrounded, amid shrieks and hisses, catcalls, cries of boodler, thief, robber. There are many such little dramatic incidents after the ordinance had been introduced. Henceforth on the streets, in the wards and outlying sections, and even on occasion in the business heart, behold the marching clubs, those sinister, ephemeral organizations which on demand of the mayor had cropped out into existence, great companies of the unheralded, the dull, the undistinguished, clerks, working men, small business men, and minor scions of religion or morality, all tramping to and fro of an evening, after working hours, assembling in cheap halls and party club houses, and drilling themselves to what end? that they might march to the city hall on the fateful Monday night when the street railway ordinances should be up for passage, and demand of unregenerate lawmakers that they do their duty. Cowperwood, coming down to his office one morning on his own elevated lines, was the observer of a button or badge worn upon the coat lapel of stolid, inconsequential citizens who sat reading their papers, unconscious of that presence which epitomized the terror and the power they all feared. One of these badges had for its device a gallows with a free noose suspended. Another was blazoned with the query, "Are we going to be robbed?" On signboards, fences, and dead walls, huge posters 4 by 6 feet in dimension were displayed. Walden H. Lucas against the boodlers. Every citizen of Chicago should come down to the city hall tonight, Monday, December 12th, and every Monday night thereafter while the streetcar franchises are under consideration, and see that the interests of the city are protected against boodleism. Citizens, arouse and defeat the boodlers. In the papers were flaring headlines. In the clubs, halls, and churches fiery speeches could nightly be heard. Men were drunk now with a kind of fury of contest. They would not succumb to this Titan who was bent on undoing them. They would not be devoured by this Gorgon of the East. He should be made to pay an honest return to the city or get out. No 50-year franchise should be granted him. The Mears law must be repealed, and he must come into the city council humble and with clean hands. No alderman who received as much as $1 for his vote should in this instance be safe with his life. Needless to say that in the face of such a campaign of intimidation only great courage could win. The aldermen were only human. In the council committee chamber Cowperwood went freely among them, explaining as he best could the justice of his course, and making it plain that, although willing to buy his rights, he looked on them as no more than his due. The rule of council was barter, and he accepted it. His unshaken and unconquerable defiance heartened his followers greatly, and the thought of $30,000 was as a buttress against many terrors. At the same time, many an alderman speculated solemnly as to what he would do afterward and where he would go once he had sold out. At last the Monday night arrived, which was to bring the final test of strength. Picture the large, ponderous structure of black granite, erected at the expense of millions, and suggesting somewhat the somnolent architecture of ancient Egypt, which served as the city hall and county courthouse combined. On this evening the 4 streets surrounding it were packed with thousands of people. To this throng Cowperwood has become an astounding figure, his wealth fabulous, his heart iron, his intentions sinister, the acme of cruel, plotting deviltry. Only this day the Chronicle, calculating well the hour and the occasion, had completely covered one of its pages with an intimate though exaggerated description of Cowperwood's house in New York, his court of orchids, his sunrise room, the baths of pink and blue alabaster, the finishings of marble and intaglio. Here Cowperwood was represented as seated in a swinging divan, his various books, art treasures, and comforts piled about him. The idea was vaguely suggested that in his sybaritic hours odalisques danced before him, and unnameable indulgences and excesses were perpetrated. At the same hour, in the council chamber itself, were assembling as hungry and bold a company of gray wolves as was ever gathered under one roof. The room was large, ornamented to the south by tall windows, its ceiling supporting a heavy, intricate chandelier, its 66 aldermanic desks arranged in half circles, one behind the other, its woodwork of black oak carved and highly polished, its walls a dark blue-gray decorated with arabesque in gold, thus giving to all proceedings an air of dignity and stateliness. Above the speaker's head was an immense portrait in oil of a former mayor, poorly done, dusty, and yet impressive. The size and character of the place gave on ordinary occasion a sort of resonance to the voices of the speakers. Tonight, through the closed windows could be heard the sound of distant drums and marching feet. In the hall outside the council door were packed at least 1,000 men with ropes, sticks, a fife and drum corps which occasionally struck up "Hail Columbia, Happy Land," "My Country 'Tis of Thee," and "Dixie." Alderman Schlumbaum, heckled to within an inch of his life, followed to the council door by 300 of his fellow citizens, was there left with the admonition that they would be waiting for him when he should make his exit. He was at last seriously impressed. "What is this?" he asked of his neighbor and nearest associate, Alderman Gravekin, when he gained the safety of his seat. "A free country?" "Search me," replied his compatriot, wearily. "I've never seen such a band as I have to deal with out in the 20th. Why, my God, a man can't call his name his own any more out here. It's got so now the newspapers tell everybody what to do." Alderman Pinsky and Alderman Horacorn, conferring together in one corner, were both very dour. "I'll tell you what, Joe," said Pinsky to his confrere, "it's this fellow Lucas that has got the people so stirred up. I didn't go home last night because I didn't want those fellows to follow me down there. Me and my wife stayed downtown. But one of the boys was over here at Jake's a little while ago, and he says there must have been 500 people around my house at 6 o'clock already. What do you think of that?" "Same here. I don't take much stock in this lynching idea. Still, you can't tell. I don't know whether the police could help us much or not. It's a damned outrage. Cowperwood has a fair proposition. What's the matter with them, anyhow?" Renewed sounds of "Marching Through Georgia" from without. Enter at this time Aldermen Zinner, Knudsen, Revere, Rogers, Tiernan, and Kerrigan. Of all the aldermen, perhaps Messrs. Tiernan and Kerrigan were as cool as any. Still, the spectacle of streets blocked with people who carried torches and wore badges showing the slip nooses attached to a gallows was rather serious. "I'll tell you, Pat," said Smiling Mike, as they eventually made the door through throngs of jeery citizens, "it does look a little rough. What do you think?" "The hell with them," replied Kerrigan angrily, waspish, determined. "They don't run me or my ward. I'll vote as I damn please." "Same here," replied Tiernan with a great show of courage. "That goes for me. But it's pretty warm anyhow, huh?" "Yes, it's warm all right," replied Kerrigan, suspicious lest his companion in arms might be weakening. "But that'll never make a quitter out of me." "Nor me either," replied the smiling one. Enter now the mayor, accompanied by a fife and drum corps rendering "Hail to the Chief." He ascends the rostrum. Outside in the halls, the huzzas of the populace. In the gallery overhead, a picked audience. As the various aldermen look up, they contemplate a sea of unfriendly faces. "Get on the mayor's guest list," commented one of the aldermen to another, cynically. A little sparring for time while minor matters are considered, and the gallery is given opportunity for comment on the various communal lights, identifying for itself first one local celebrity and then another. There's Johnny Dowling, that big blond fellow with the round head. There's Pinsky. Look at the little rat. There's Kerrigan. Get on to the emerald. Pat? How's the jewelry? You won't get any chance to do any grafting tonight, Pat. You won't pass no ordinance tonight. Alderman Winkler, pro Cowperwood. "If the chair pleases, I think something ought to be done to restore order in the gallery and keep these proceedings from being disturbed. It seems to me an outrage that on an occasion of this kind, when the interests of the people require the most careful attention—" A voice. "The interests of the people?" Another voice. "Sit down. You're bought." Alderman Winkler. "If the chair pleases." The mayor. "I shall have to ask the audience in the gallery to keep quiet in order that the business in hand may be considered. Applause, and the gallery lapses into silence. Alderman Geigler to Alderman Sumlusky. Well trained, eh? Alderman Ballenberg. Pro Cowperwood, getting up. Large, brown, florid, smooth-faced. Before calling up an ordinance which bears my name, I should like to ask permission of the council to make a statement. When I introduced this ordinance last week, I said— A voice. We know what you said. Alderman Ballenberg. I said that I did so by request. I want to explain that it was at the request of a number of gentlemen who have since appeared before the committee of this council that now has this ordinance. A voice. That's all right, Ballenberg. We know by whose request you introduced it. You've said your little say. Alderman Ballenberg. If the chair pleases. A voice. Sit down, Ballenberg. Give some other boodler a chance. The mayor. Will the gallery please stop interrupting? Alderman Havranek, jumping to his feet. This is an outrage. The gallery is packed with people come here to intimidate us. Here is a great public corporation that has served this city for years and served it well, and when it comes to this body with a sensible proposition, we ain't even allowed to consider it. The mayor packs the gallery with his friends, and the papers stir up people to come down here by thousands and try to frighten us. I, for one. A voice. What's the matter, Billy? Haven't you got your money yet? Alderman Havranek, Polish-American, intelligent, even artistic-looking, shaking his fist at the gallery. You dare not come down here and say that, you coward. A chorus of 50 voices. Rats. Also, Billy, you ought to have wings. Alderman Tiernan, rising. I say now, Mr. Mayor, don't you think we've had enough of this? A voice. Well, look who's here, if it ain't Smiling Mike. Another voice. How much do you expect to get, Mike? Alderman Tiernan, turning to the gallery. I want to say I can lick any man that wants to come down here and talk to me to my face. I'm not afraid of no ropes and no guns. These corporations have done everything for the city. A voice. Aw. Alderman Tiernan. If it wasn't for the streetcar companies, we wouldn't have any city. 10 voices. Aw. Alderman Tiernan, bravely. My mind ain't the mind of some people. A voice. I should say not. Alderman Tiernan. I'm talking for compensation for the privileges we expect to give. A voice. You're talking for your pocketbook. Alderman Tiernan. I don't give a damn for these cheapskates and cowards in the gallery. I say treat these corporations right. They have helped make the city. A chorus of 50 voices. Ah, you want to treat yourself right. That's what you want. You vote right tonight or you'll be sorry. By now the various aldermen outside of the most hardened characters were more or less terrified by the grilling contest. It could do no good to battle with his gallery or the crowd outside. Above them sat the mayor, before them reporters, ticking in shorthand every phrase and word. I don't see what we can do, said Alderman Pinsky to Alderman Havranek, his neighbor. It looks to me as if we might just as well not try. At this point arose Alderman Gilleran, small, pale, intelligent, anti-Cowperwood. By prearrangement, he had been scheduled to bring the second and, as it proved, the final test of strength to the issue. If the chair pleases, he said, I move that the vote by which the Ballenberg 50-year ordinance was referred to the Joint Committee of Streets and Alleys be reconsidered, and that instead it be referred to the Committee on City Hall. This was a committee that hitherto had always been considered by members of the council as of the least importance. Its principal duties consisted in devising new names for streets and regulating the hours of City Hall servants. There were no perquisites, no graft. In spite of ribald defiance at the organization of the present session, all the mayor's friends, the reformers, those who could not be trusted, had been relegated to this committee. Now it was proposed to take this ordinance out of the hands of friends and send it here from whence unquestionably it would never reappear. The great test had come. Alderman Hobercorn, mouthpiece for his gang, because the most skillful in a parliamentary sense. The vote cannot be reconsidered, he begins a long explanation amid hisses. A voice. How much have you got? A second voice. You've been a boodler all your life. Alderman Hobercorn, turning to the gallery, a light of defiance in his eye. You come here to intimidate us, but you can't do it. You're too contemptible to notice. A voice. You hear the drums, don't you? A second voice. Vote wrong, Hobercorn, and see. We know you. Alderman Tiernan to himself. Say, that's pretty rough, ain't it? The mayor. Motion overruled. The point is not well taken. Alderman Gulager, rising a little puzzled. Do we vote now on the Gilleran resolution? A voice. You bet you do, and you vote right. The mayor. Yes. The clerk will call the roll. The clerk reading the names, beginning with the A's. Outvast, pro Cowperwood. Alderman Outvast. Yea. Fear had conquered him. Alderman Tiernan to Alderman Kerrigan. Well, there's one baby down. Alderman Kerrigan. Yep. Ballenberg, pro Cowperwood, the man who had introduced the ordinance. Yea. Alderman Tiernan. Say, is Ballenberg weakened? Alderman Kerrigan. It looks that way. Canna. Yea. Fogarty. Yea. Alderman Tiernan nervously. There goes Fogarty. Havranek. Yea. Alderman Tiernan. And Havranek? Alderman Kerrigan, referring to the courage of his colleagues. It's coming out of their hair. In exactly 80 seconds the roll call was in, and Cowperwood had lost, 41-25. It was plain that the ordinance could never be revived. End of chapter 61. Chapter 62 of The Titan by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Recompense. You have seen perhaps a man whose heart was weighed by a great woe. You have seen the eye darken, the soul fag, and the spirit congeal under the breath of an icy disaster. At 10:30 of this particular evening, Cowperwood, sitting alone in the library of his Michigan Avenue house, was brought face to face with the fact that he had lost. He had built so much on the cast of this single die. It was useless to say to himself that he could go into the council a week later with a modified ordinance, or could wait until the storm had died out. He refused himself these consolations. Already he had battled so long and so vigorously, by every resource and subtlety which his mind had been able to devise. All week long on divers occasions he had stood in the council chamber where the committee had been conducting its hearings. Small comfort to know that by suits, injunctions, appeals, and writs to intervene, he could tie up this transit situation and leave it for years and years the prey of lawyers, the despair of the city, a hopeless muddle which would not be unraveled until he and his enemies should long be dead. This contest had been so long in the brewing, he had gone about it with such care years before, and now the enemy had been heartened by a great victory. His aldermen, powerful, hungry, fighting men, all, like those picked soldiers of the ancient Roman emperors, ruthless, conscienceless, as desperate as himself, had in their last redoubt of personal privilege fallen, weakened, yielded. How could he hearten them to another struggle? How face the blazing wrath of a mighty populace that had once learned how to win? Others might enter here. Heckelheimer, Fischel, any one of a half a dozen Eastern giants, and smooth out the ruffled surface of the angry sea that he had blown to a fury. But as for him, he was tired, sick of Chicago, sick of this interminable contest. Only recently he had promised himself that if he were to turn this great trick he would never again attempt anything so desperate or requiring so much effort. He would not need to. The size of his fortune made it of little worth. Besides, in spite of his tremendous vigor, he was getting on. Since he had alienated Aileen, he was quite alone, out of touch with anyone identified with the earlier years of his life. His all-desired Berenice still evaded him. True, she had shown lately a kind of warming sympathy, but what was it? Gracious tolerance, perhaps? A sense of obligation? Certainly little more, he felt. He looked into the future, deciding heavily that he must fight on, whatever happened, and then... While he sat thus drearily pondering, answering a telephone call now and then, the doorbell rang, and the servant brought a card which he said had been presented by a young woman who declared that it would bring immediate recognition. Glancing at it, Cowperwood jumped to his feet and hurried downstairs into the one presence he most craved. There are compromises of spirit too elusive and subtle to be traced in all their involute windings. From the earliest days when Berenice Fleming had first set eyes on Cowperwood, she had been moved by a sense of power, an amazing and fascinating individuality. Since then, by degrees, he had familiarized her with a thought of individual freedom of action and a disregard of current social standards which were destructive to an earlier conventional view of things. Following him through the Chicago fight, she had been caught by the wonder of his dreams. He was on the way toward being one of the world's greatest money giants. During his recent trips East, she had sometimes felt that she was able to read in the cast of his face the intensity of this great ambition, which had for its ultimate aim herself. So he had once assured her. Always with her he had been so handsome, so pleading, so patient. So here she was in Chicago tonight, the guest of friends at the Richelieu, and standing in Cowperwood's presence. "Why, Berenice," he said, extending a cordial hand. "When did you arrive in town? What brings you here?" He had once tried to make her promise that if ever her feelings toward him changed, she would let him know of it in some way. And here she was tonight. On what errand? He noted her costume of brown silk and velvet, how well it seemed to suggest her cat-like grace. "You bring me here," she replied, with an indefinable something in her voice which was at once a challenge and a confession. "I thought from what I had just been reading that you might really need me now." "You mean?" he inquired, looking at her with vivid eyes. There he paused. "That I have made up my mind? Besides, I ought to pay some time." "Berenice," he exclaimed reproachfully. "No, I don't mean that either," she replied. "I am sorry now. I think I understand you better. Besides," she added, with a sudden gaiety that had a touch of self-consolation in it, "I want to." "Berenice, truly?" "Can't you tell?" she queried. "Well, then," he smiled, holding out his hands, and to his amazement she came forward. "I can't explain myself to myself quite," she added in a hurried, low, eager tone, "but I couldn't stay away any longer. I had the feeling that you might be going to lose here for the present. But I want you to go somewhere else if you have to. London or Paris. The world won't understand us quite, but I do." "Berenice," he smoothed her cheek and hair. "Not so close, please. And there aren't to be any other ladies, unless you want me to change my mind." "Not another one, as I hope to keep you. You will share everything I have." For answer? How strange are realities as opposed to illusion! End of chapter 62. Chapter 63 of The Titan by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In Retrospect. The world is doused with too much religion. Life is to be learned from life, and the professional moralist is at best but a manufacturer of shoddy wares. At the ultimate remove, God, or the life force, if anything, is an equation, and at its nearest expression for man, the contract social, it is that also. Its method of expression appears to be that of generating the individual in all his glittering variety and scope, and through him progressing to the mass with its problems. In the end a balance is invariably struck wherein the mass subdues the individual, or the individual the mass, for the time being. For behold, the sea is ever dancing or raging. In the meantime there have sprung up social words and phrases expressing a need of balance, of equation. These are right, justice, truth, morality, an honest mind, a pure heart, all words meaning a balance must be struck. The strong must not be too strong, the weak not too weak. But without variation, how could the balance be maintained? Nirvana, nirvana, the ultimate, still equation. Rushing like a great comet to the zenith, his path a blazing trail, Cowperwood did for the hour illuminate the terrors and wonders of individuality, but for him also the eternal equation, the pathos of the discovery that even giants are but pygmies, and that an ultimate balance must be struck. Of the strange, tortured, terrified reflection of those who, caught in his wake, were swept from the normal and the commonplace, what shall we say? Legislators by the hundred, who were hounded from politics into their graves, a half a hundred aldermen of various councils who were driven grumbling or whining into the limbo of the dull, the useless, the commonplace, a splendid governor dreaming of an ideal on the one hand, succumbing to material necessity on the other, traducing the spirit that aided him the while he tortured himself with his own doubts. A second governor, more amenable, was to be greeted by the hisses of the populace, to retire brooding and discomfited, and finally to take his own life. Shy heart in hand, venomous men both, unable to discover whether they had really triumphed, were to die eventually puzzled. A mayor whose greatest hour was in thwarting one who contemned him lived to say, "It is a great mystery." He was a strange man. A great city struggled for a score of years to untangle that which was all but beyond the power of solution, a true Gordian knot. And this giant himself, rushing on to new struggles and new difficulties in an older land, forever suffering the goad of a restless heart, for him was no ultimate peace, no real understanding, but only hunger and thirst and wonder. Wealth, 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 a new grasp of a new great problem and its eventual solution, anew the old urgent thirst for life, and only its partial quenchment. In Dresden, a palace for one woman. In Rome, a second for another. In London, a third for his beloved Berenice, the lure of beauty ever in his eye. The lives of two women wrecked, a score of victims despoiled. Berenice herself weary, yet brilliant, turning to others for recompense for her lost youth. And he resigned, and yet not loving, understanding, doubting, caught at last by the drug of a personality which he could not gainsay. What shall we say of life in the last analysis? Peace, be still? Or shall we battle sternly for that equation which we know will be maintained whether we battle or not, in order that the strong become not too strong, or the weak not too weak? Or perchance, shall we say, sick of dullness, enough of this, I will have strong meat or die, and die or live? Each according to his temperament, that something which he has not made and cannot always subdue, and which may not always be subdued by others for him. Who plans the steps that lead lives onto splendid glories, or twist them into gnarled sacrifices, or make them dark, disdainful, contentious tragedies? The soul within? And whence comes it? Of God? What thought engendered the spirit of Circe, or gave to Helen the lust of tragedy? What lit the walls of Troy, or prepared the woes of an Andromache? By what demon counsel was the fate of Hamlet prepared? And why did the weird sisters plan ruin to the murderous Scot? Double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. In the mulch of darkness are bedded the roots of endless sorrows and of endless joys. Canst thou fix thine eyes on the morning? Be glad, and if in the ultimate it blind thee, be glad also. Thou hast lived. End of chapter 63. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Titan by Theodore Dreiser.